It's been 15 years since Breaking Bad aired its first episode, and nearly 10 years since it concluded. After I did my Better Call Saul ranking, it only made sense to do a Breaking Bad one as well. And after a full rewatch of the show for my first time in years, plus another Saul rewatch for full measure, it's finally time to do it. My opinion on this show has changed a lot with this most recent viewing, and some of the placements on this list may not be what you would expect. I'm not including El Camino on here since it doesn't really fit and is worthy of its own video in the future. Obviously, this video will have spoilers for the entirety of Breaking Bad, as well as Better Call Saul, so be warned. With all that said, this is every Breaking Bad episode ranked. Number 62, Down. This episode is not really bad per se, but it isn't exactly the most fun time in the world. Down is fittingly a downer episode, where Jesse has to deal with constant failure, while Walt has to deal with Skyler not wanting anything to do with him after the whole second cell phone debacle. This episode continues the season 2 trend of a pointless black and white teddy bear cold opens, which I just don't care for at all, but we'll talk more about those later on. Jesse is broke and needs money from Walt, but he only gives him $600 because he's a stingy Then his parents kick him out of his house because he's such a screw-up. I do like the scene of Jesse and his mum because you can kind of sympathize with both sides of the argument. Bitch! Then we have the scene where Jesse tries to rekindle his friendship with this guy from high school, but he gets rejected there as well. Eventually he finds a new home in a porta potty. Meanwhile, Walt tries to get Skyler to stop thinking he's a liar, which doesn't work because he's a liar. He takes his rage out on Jesse, and they have a fight for the ages in the RV. Jesse wins and gets his money, while Skyler gets judged for smoking while being pregnant. Just kind of a whatever episode, honestly. Number 61, Cancer Man. This episode is where everyone finds out about Walt's cancer and the ramifications of that. Skyler tries to blame the chemicals Walt worked with 20 years ago, Marie immediately jumps into working out the best next move for him, and Hank assures him that he'll take care of the family if the worst happens, which Walt doesn't seem to appreciate. Walt isn't interested in getting treatment, so Junior calls him out for being a bitch. This episode is the first time we see Skinny Pete and Combo, who are very impressed with Jesse's new product. He tries to stay at his parents' house for a bit, but doesn't even manage to last the whole episode before being kicked out. Jesse goes to Walt's house for a BJ and pays him $4,000. Walt takes his anger out on the infamous Ken Wins, who can't seem to catch a break from these Sigmas messing with him, and does an epic walking away from explosion moment. Number 60, Bit by a Dead Bee. Walt's genius plan to explain away his absence in the previous episode is to just get naked and go to the store. It works for some reason, and Walt gets sent to the hospital where he pretends to conveniently have forgotten everything that's happened since he disappeared. Skyler doesn't seem to be satisfied with this explanation though, and the doctors aren't going to let Walt leave until they're sure he's good to go. Eventually he gives up and just tells the psychiatrist that he just left the house to get away from his annoying family. He then somehow manages to sneak out of the hospital, check on his money, and then take a depressing bus ride back to the hospital without anyone noticing. When he eventually gets home, Skyler asks him if he has a second cell phone, to which he pulls out another one of his unconvincing lies. Hank tries to interrogate Jesse, who says that he was at the hotel just getting Wendy's from Wendy all weekend, even though his car was found at Tuco's place with a ton of money in it. After Wendy vouches for him and Hector chooses to shit his pants instead of exposing him, they're left with no choice but to just release Jesse. Number 59, Breakage. Jesse is keen to move out of his porta potty home and meets Jane for the first time while house searching. Walt and Jesse are determined to get back to business after the Tuco debacle since both of them have expenses, and after some arguing about who gets to call the shots, Jesse decides they're going to use their own dealers to distribute the product instead of dealing with another Tuco. Jesse recruits the dream team of Badger, Skinny Pete and Combo to sling meth for $2,500 an ounce, with $2,000 going back to Jesse and Walt. Everything goes great until Petey immediately gets himself robbed by Spooge and his ATM-loving lady. Walt goes alpha mode on Jesse and demands he deal with him. Hank is in a bad mood after his detective skills get him a new gig at El Paso, which for some reason he's not very happy about. So he decides to take the day off and brew Schrader Brow instead, which leads to him exploding in the middle of the night and making him also shoot Marie. Kind of just a whatever episode minus Jesse meeting Jane, which is good. Number 58, Open House. This is often regarded as the worst episode of a show, and it's the lowest rated one on IMDb, apart from that other episode which we'll get to later. The episode treats us to the return of one of the most important plotlines in the show, Marie's kleptomania. It's so crucial that the title of the episode is in reference to it, with Marie going to various open houses to steal random crap. Eventually, the real estate agent catches wind of what's going on, and when she confronts Marie, they have a fight for the ages, leading to her crying like a baby. Meanwhile, Walt's mad because Gus installed security cameras in the super lab, but Jesse doesn't seem to care, and is more interested in going go-karting. Walt commits one of the most evil crimes in the entire show when he turns down Jesse's offer, leaving him to go karting by himself, and then back home to his 24/7 rager taking place in his house. Skylar insists on getting a move on with their big car wash purchase, but Walt isn't interested until she brings up how Bogdan insulted his manliness, which sets him off and makes him intent on getting the car wash, even though Saul wants him to use the nail salon instead. In a ploy to get Bogdan to let them buy the car wash, Skylar gets Saul's lackey to troll him into thinking he has contaminated water or something, and he ends up agreeing to Skylar's offer of $800,000. Tim Roberts visits Hank to get his input on the Bedecker case, thinking that he was involved with some sort of meth super lab. He doesn't seem interested at first, but eventually he does start reading Gal's notebook, setting in motion his return to the Heisenberg case. Number 57. 737. I know there's been a lot of early season 2 at the bottom of this list, and that's because it's probably the least good period of the show in my opinion. The opener of season 2 introduces us to the worst cold opens in the series, the teddy bear flash forwards. Maybe if they amounted to something good it wouldn't be so bad, but they kinda don't, so they're just a chore to sit through and rewatch. The episode proper starts off right where season 1 ended off, with Tuco beating that guy to a pulp and getting hyped over it. After trying and failing to save the guy, Walt calculates that he needs precisely $737,000 to cover his family's future, which he doesn't seem to think is enough just a year later. Walt gets home and tries to fucking Skylar, which is a little bit disturbing. She just chalks it up to him being stressed over the cancer. Jesse gets a gun from the doghouse and lays out his plan to deal with Tuco, since it's only a matter of time before he wastes them, but Walt points out a bunch of cinema sins and doesn't think Jesse has the guts to go through with it anyway. Walt has a better idea to poison Tuco with ricin by presenting it as their latest and greatest meth invention. This kicks off the show-long Chekhov's ricin plot, which doesn't end up being used on someone until the very last episode. Before they can execute their plan, Tuco ruins it by kidnapping both of them and taking them to a much better episode. Meanwhile, Skylar is pissy at Marie over the whole stolen tiara thing, and when Hank tries to get her to get over it, she unleashes an epic rant about how shitty her life is, which Anna Gunn acts out perfectly. Marie also commits one of the most brutal murders of the show in this episode. Number 56. No Mas. The first episode of season 3 introduces us to everyone's favourite assassins, the twins, and also introduces us to the best character in the show, Angsty Walt. Hot off the heels of being dumped by Skylar, the start of season 3 is all about him basically falling apart. He seems to feel pretty guilty about the whole plane crash thing, so he goes to burn his money, but he quickly realizes how stupid that is and throws it into the pool of insanity. While Hank is helping him move out, Walt tries to flex his $500,000 cash, but Hank just laughs in his face because he knows Walt's actually a broke loser. Then at the school, Carmen tries to get Walt to say a few words about how the plane crash affected him, but he instead launches into this spiel about how it actually wasn't that bad in the grand scheme of things, and ends up just making himself look like an idiot. Skylar visits him at his new bachelor pad, and finally gets him to admit that he's a meth cook, and doesn't stay to hear him explain the difference between manufacturing and dealing drugs. Gus tries to strike while the iron is hot and get Walt to start cooking again, but he's too depressed to have any interest. Meanwhile, Jesse's having a fun time at therapy planting flowers, and after a session with the group leader where he reveals he ran over his daughter while drunk, he decides to accept that he's responsible for Jane's death in the plane crash, which doesn't seem to sit right with Walt for some reason. Number 55. Kafkaesque. Walt and Jesse are finally officially at work in the super lab, with the cold open showing us just how efficient the whole operation is under Gus's watchful eye. While weighing their latest batch, Jesse does some number crunching and realizes that the $1.5 million they're each making are pennies on the dollar compared to what Gus is raking in, but Walt just brushes it off as classic capitalism, with some delicious future hypocrisy to boot.
You are now a millionaire, and you're complaining? We have suffered and bled, literally, for this business. And I will not throw it away for nothing.
I don't know how else to say it, Mr. White. $5 million isn't nothing.
Jesse complains about his new job at the support group, with a pretty accurate depiction of the whole thing.
My boss is a dick. The owner's super dick. I'm not worthy or whatever to meet him, but I guess everybody's scared of the dude. Place is full of dead-eyed douchebags. The hours suck and nobody knows what's going on, so...
In another meeting, he tells this great story about his woodworking teacher back in high school, and how he motivated him to make the best wooden box anyone's ever seen, which he supposedly ended up giving to his mother. Jesse decides to go full dickhead mode, and gets Badger and Skinny Pete to start coming to the meetings, so they control all the recovering addicts into relapsing. SAUL introduces Jesse to the world of money laundering and offers him the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to own a nail salon, since he's probably still salty that Mrs. Nguyen kicked him out all those years ago. Jesse isn't interested though, especially when SAUL doesn't give him the laundering discount that he gave Walt previously. Meanwhile, Walt finds out how Hank survived the twins' ambush and meets with Gus so he can assure his safety while also netting a cool $15 million a year deal. He goes drunk driving to celebrate and almost crashes into a truck. Marie is fretting over Hank's extensive medical bills, and suddenly Skylar offers to pay for them, and comes up with this elaborate story where Walt made a ton of money gambling like a true Sigma male. She says she was so good at lying because she learned from the best, even though Walt was like the worst liar in the world whenever it came to Skylar. Number 54. 38 Snub. This episode shows just how depressed everyone is about their situation, with Walt buying a gun from Lawson in a desperate attempt to get rid of Gus, but instead he's been replaced by Tyrus. Walt tries going straight to Gus's house to get the job done, but is stopped before he even reaches the door, since Gus has FNAF security cameras spying on him. There was a bit of questioning as to whether the person calling Walt was Mike, Gus, or Tyrus, and it turns out it's actually Tyrus, which is weird because I'm pretty sure this is the only time we hear him say Walt's name.
Go home, Walter.
In a desperate move, he tries to convince Mike to join the anti-Gus club, but all he gets out of it is a couple bruises. I also love the Wayfarer advert from SAUL that's playing on the TV, as well as Mike's reaction. Jesse is probably at his lowest point after killing Gale, and throws a 24/7 rager to distract himself. He tries to keep it going for as long as possible, but eventually everyone, including Skinny Pete and Badger, leave. Hank is in full mode, constantly dismissing Marie while he works through his physical therapy, only acknowledging her when it's regarding his oh-so-precious minerals. Skylar scopes out the car wash and tries to make an offer to Bogdan, but is shut down since he still has a hate boner for Walt, after he insulted his luscious eyebrows. Number 53. A no rough stuff type deal. The finale of Season 1 wasn't originally going to be the finale, but thanks to the writer's strike it ended up having to be, and yeah, you can kinda tell. It's not a bad episode by any means, but it doesn't really have that finale oomph that it probably should have. Jesse and Walt are now in business with Tuco, and need to cook 4 pounds of meth to appease him, even though they don't have enough pseudo to make it. So they decide to switch to a methylamine cook instead, which means they have to steal a barrel of the stuff. Jesse knows guys who can do it for them, but Walt thinks they can do it themselves. They end up executing the greatest heist in history, stealing a barrel and slowly carrying it away. Even that idiot Hank knew that you should roll it instead, but Walt later learns from this mistake. Him and Hank have a debate over the legality of things, and Skylar is surprised when Marie presents her with an extravagant tiara at her baby shower, which she definitely acquired through legal means. When she tries to return it, the owner tries to get her arrested, so she pretends to go into labor to get out of it, like a true girl boss. Walt and Jesse manage to get Tuco the meth they promised, now with the signature blue color thanks to the methylamine. Tuco thanks him by beating the shit out of his henchman when he tries to assert dominance, who seemingly hasn't learned anything from the last time he tried to back Tuco up. Tuco says he'll see them next week, ending the episode on a pleasant note. Number 52. IFT. Walt and Skylar's divorce back and forth reaches a stalemate, with him moving back in and her calling the cops on him, but they can't make him leave since he's just hanging out. So Walt does get to move back into the house, but Skylar isn't going to make it pleasant for him, making him sleep on the floor and piss in the sink. Skylar goes to a divorce lawyer / therapist and tells her that Walt's a drug dealer since they have attorney-client privilege. She obviously recommends that Skylar sue Walt and make the divorce official, but now she has doubts. Walt justifies his criminal activities by saying the money will get the kids through college and whatnot, and she thanks him for it by fucking Ted. She drops the news on Walt when she gets home, finally revealing what IFT stands for.
I fucked Ted.
Jesse isn't having much of a better time, with him repeatedly calling Jane's phone to hear her voicemail, until SAUL interrupts to get him to ask Walt to start cooking again. Hank's in a mood after he finds out he's wanted back at El Paso, and takes his anger out on a bunch of randos at a bar, and abuses his status as a cop to get away with it. The Salamancas have a meeting with Gus to complain about how they want to kill Walt, but Gus vetoes it since he needs him for his business. Hector's probably so done with Gus's bullshit at this point since he knows he killed Lalo, but it's not like he can say anything about it. Number 51. Abacue. This episode is sandwiched between the Fly episode and Half Measures, and as such often gets forgotten when discussing the show, which is a shame because there's some pretty great stuff here, like Skylar meeting SAUL for the first time, since she wants to be sure Walt's doing his criminal stuff properly. Pretty much every line of dialogue in this scene is just hilarious, and SAUL begins his mission of trying to get every character in the show to buy the laser tag place supposedly owned by Price. Skylar isn't interested though, and decides they should buy the car wash Walt used to work at instead. She also offers to be Walt's money launderer, and when Walt tries to shut her down, she reveals she never signed the divorce papers, meaning that they would have spousal privilege, much like Jimmy and Kim did. Meanwhile, Jesse continues his epic plan to make all the recovering addicts of his support group relapse. And when Pete and Badger start to feel bad about it, he decides to show them how a true alpha operates, by hooking up with Andrea. But when he finds out she has a kid, he suddenly gains a moral compass and calls her a terrible mother. Thankfully, Andrea thinks he's cool, so he doesn't end up fumbling the bag. Things get extra interesting when Jesse realizes her brother is the kid who killed Combo. He does some detective work and finds out that the meth those guys are selling is blue, which means they're part of Gus's squad. Hank's being a to Marie as usual when he finds out he's going to be released from the hospital, claiming he isn't going to leave until he can walk again. Gus invites Walt over to his house for a playdate, where he cooks whatever this is and makes some remarks that would incline us to believe that Gus has kids like Walt. But if you've watched my video analysing Gus, then you would know that he's just lying about it to make Walt relate to him more, since there's zero other mentions of Gus's supposed kids throughout both this show and Better Call Saul. This episode also has the last appearance of Jane, in a flashback to when they went to the Vagina Museum. Number 50. Grey Matter. This episode formally introduces us to Walt's former associates, Gretchen and Elliot, when he and Skylar go to Elliot's birthday party. Walt's an insecure little baby and gets flustered when someone asks him what university he teaches at, and this is the first time we get to really see the magnitude of his ego and pride, when Elliot offers him a job back at Grey Matter so he can afford to pay for his cancer treatment. Now, any normal person would jump at this opportunity, especially since it's the kind of work Walt's supposed to be passionate about, but the idea of someone else helping him is just so insulting that he would rather cook meth instead. Walt comes home to the family waiting for him with the dreaded talking pillow, where they say their thoughts on Walt refusing cancer treatment. Hank wants him to get it, Junior just wants him to die, and Marie sides with Walt wanting to die on his own terms, which makes Skylar pretty mad. Meanwhile, Jesse's trying to get back into the meth game with Badger instead of Walt, since his attempt to get a real job was an epic fail, but their cooking yields less than ideal results, leading to them having an epic fight scene. Walt changes his mind and decides to get cancer treatment, and when Gretchen calls him to accept their money, he dismisses her and goes to Jesse's house to get back on the meth grind. Number 49. 51. This episode has one of the most bizarre cold opens, where Walt decides to sell his Aztec for a whopping $50 and gets a new whip for himself, and then for Junior as well, while dated dubstep music plays. Walt continues his season 5 arc of being the most annoying guy in the room by being a to Skylar on his birthday, basically forcing her to make his bacon into a 51 like she's supposed to. After she seemingly tries to drown herself in the pool of insanity, Hank and Marie take the kids and Walt argues with Skylar about her not appreciating his Sigma lifestyle, to the point where she says she's just going to wait for the cancer to kill him. This scene, along with all the other Skylar scenes early in this season, is just uncomfortable to watch, honestly. Meanwhile, Lydia's methylamine guy gets busted by the feds, meaning Jesse has to go collect the barrels instead, but when he's getting it with the forklift, they discover a GPS tracker under it. Mike immediately assumes Lydia's in cahoots with the cops, so he heads off to whack her, but Jesse doesn't think that's very nice of him. For an episode directed by Rian Johnson, this one doesn't really stand out compared to his other 2 episodes. Number 48. Madrigal. This episode continues dealing with the fallout of Season 4's ending, with Madrigal being investigated for its connections to Poyos and Gus. Peter Schuler finds out about this, and decides he'd rather end it all on the toilet than face the consequences. We are introduced to Lydia, who's anxious about Mike's 11 guys who could pose a threat to them. She tries to subtly suggest offing them, but Mike isn't keen on the idea, since he has something of a moral compass. Speaking of Mike, he's basically the main character of this episode, with his plotline taking up the majority of the runtime, and Walt/Jesse being relegated to a couple scenes. Jesse's all paranoid that the rice and ciggy he supposedly lost is going to turn up somewhere, so Walt, being the nice guy that he is, goes over to his house to help look for it. When they do apparently find it, Jesse cries like a baby about how he was almost going to kill Mr. White over a simple misunderstanding, and Walt uses this opportunity to float the idea of getting back to business. They approach Mike with their plan, but he isn't interested, since he knows Walt's just a recipe for disaster. They decide to get going without him though, and while brainstorming potential lab locations with Saul, he suggests that maybe they should move on and get real jobs. Walt's too Sigma to entertain the idea though, since he's a broke bitch. Mike's called into the DEA office for a sit-down with Hank and Gomi, where they taunt him over finding Kaylee's nest egg, although he manages to avoid saying anything incriminating. A suspicious call from Chow leads Mike to discover one of his former colleagues killed him and is being paid by Lydia. So he decides to pay her a visit at her extravagant house, and is about to cap her, but stops when he realizes he needs a new source of income. Number 47. Bullet points. This episode, like other early season episodes, is all about laying the groundwork for plotlines to come. Walt's still ultra paranoid that Gus is going to snuff him out at any moment, and his fear isn't helped by Hank coming dangerously close to connecting the dots of Gale in the Walt Whitman book. Thankfully, Hank is an idiot and doesn't see the truth literally spelled out for him. Walt goes to Jesse's party to make him feel bad about it, and then he goes to SAUL to complain about how shitty his life is, and SAUL brings up Ed the Disappearer for the first time, but Walt isn't quite desperate enough to need him yet. Meanwhile, Skylar is trying to prepare Walt so they can tell Hank and Marie about his supposed gambling addiction, and this scene where they're going over Skylar's script is just hilarious, with so many good lines.
Up where we left off.
I'm weak. I'm out of control. I mean, this whole thing makes me look like crap.
This has to be a warts and all story, Walt. That's how we'll sell it, and we both look bad.
Oh, well, how do you look bad exactly? Where is the I slept with my boss bullet point? I can't seem to find that anywhere.
You might look down at the floor with remorse. What? You don't have to mean it. You just stare down at your feet, Walt, okay? Then, maybe I'll tear up a little.
You're gonna cry? On cue?
I said, I don't know, maybe.
When you dab your eyes, you're gonna do it with your right hand or your left hand?
It's just an idea.
1 tear, 2 tears? How many?
This has to be convincing.
I especially love how peeved Walt gets when Skylar makes it seem like he's supposed to be regretful about what he's done, and he drops the old reliable, providing for the family line that he likes so much.
And why am I so ashamed?
Do I really need to answer that?
I was, and am, providing for our family.
When they do end up telling the rest of the family about it, they seem pretty impressed. Mike is fed up with Jesse's party hard lifestyle, so he complains about Gus about it and then takes him for a drive so they can bond with each other. There's also this awesome scene where Jesse impresses a chick with his Sonic racing skills. Number 46. I See You. This is kinda like a half bottle episode, just 2 episodes before the real bottle episode. After Hank's grisly encounter with the twins, the family sits around the hospital for the whole episode complaining about how crappy everything is. Walt and Jesse are set to officially start cooking in the super lab after a hilarious scene where Gale gets fired.
What's up, partner? I can't believe this.
Is this my replacement?
Oh, Jesus!
When Jesse gives Walt the news about what happened to Hank. Marie obviously blames the DEA guys for taking Hank's gun right before he was ambushed, and then starts blaming Walt as well since he supposedly bought weed from Jesse, which is just stupid. Gus gets a call from Balsa, who's onto him and plans to get the truth from a twin who's still alive. Gus deals with it by sending some poyos over to the hospital to distract everyone, while Mike gives the guy a lethal injection, much to the satisfaction of everyone else.
Burn in hell, you piece of shit.
Balsa calls Gus again to complain about the federales harassing him, and ends up getting killed by them while Gus listens. Meanwhile, Jesse's bored at the lab waiting for Walt to get back, so they can get to work and meet their 200 pounds a week quota, and gets caught acting goofy by Victor. Number 45. Mars. This episode is all about getting Walt back into cooking again, with Gus pulling his ultimate chip to convince Walt, questioning his masculinity. After introducing him to the super lab, Walt still won't commit to cooking again since his family life is rapidly deteriorating as a result of it. But when Gus asks him why he cooked in the first place, Walt says it was for his family. Gus gives Walt the ultimate alpha male speech about how a man provides for his family, and since Walt is a delusional idiot, this is enough to finally get him back in the saddle. Before this, there's also this hilarious scene where Walt berates Gus for pretending to accept Jesse's supposedly inferior product just to get Walt to cook again, acting like his ego wasn't hurt at all by it.
That you believe I have some proprietary kind of selfishness about my own formula. Some sort of overweening pride, I suppose. That you think simply overwhelms me, clouds my judgment.
But it doesn't.
Absolutely not.
Walt meets with SAUL and Jesse to triumphantly mock him with his $3 million deal with Gus, and SAUL, being the money-grubbing loser that he is, immediately ditches Jesse to get a ride on Walt's dick. Jesse retaliates by smashing Walt's windscreen for the 16th time. Meanwhile, Hank's deep into his RV investigation, trying to find the one that the gas station chick told him about in the previous episode, and embarrassing himself in the process. He manages to eventually track down the RV that Jesse bought/stole, which we see in the cold open. He also continues his show-long arc of being a to Marie, because he's too manly to talk about his feelings. Walt finally relents in the divorce feud with Skylar, but now that she's seen the money, she's too greedy to sign the papers herself, even though she's still rooting Ted on the regular and enjoying his heated floors. Number 44. Shotgun. This is the episode where Mike and Jesse become best friends, which is probably due to Mike actually being Jesse from the future. It's kind of funny how the cold open of this episode makes it seem like it's going to be some super tense action-packed thing, with Walt frantically speeding around thinking he's about to get killed, and then the rest of the episode is just Mike and Jesse driving around in silence. They're picking up random dead drops all over the city, and Jesse thinks he's there to be Mike's bodyguard, which makes him a bit triggered.
You are not the guy. You're not capable of being the guy. I had a guy, but now I don't. You are not the guy.
Not entirely sure who Mike's guy was, and Better Call Saul doesn't exactly make it clear who it was. Closest I can think of is like Nacho, but even that's stretching it. It definitely can't be Victor, because it's pretty obvious Mike never liked that annoying to begin with. Walt has to do with cooking by himself, and gets mad because he sucks at driving forklifts. Him and Skylar finalize the car wash deal, and when Skylar hears his voice message from the cold open, she gets turned on by it and they have sexy times in the bedroom. While doing their last pickup, some shady guys show up, so Jesse takes matters into his own hands and smashes into them with Mike's car. We later find out that it was all a setup by Gus to make Jesse think he's an awesome badass. Lastly, there's this hilarious scene where the family has dinner at Hank and Marie's place where Walt gets drunk, and when Hank says Gale was a genius, he tells her that he was obviously just copying someone else's work, and Heisenberg is actually still out there. My favorite Walt moments are the one where he acts like a complete idiot, and this one might just take the cake.
So to my eye, all this brilliance looks like nothing more than just simple rote copying. Probably of someone else's work. This genius of yours, maybe he's still out there.
Number 43, Rabid Dog. This episode is basically the hunt for Jesse, who's mysteriously vanished after pouring gasoline all over Walt's living room. Walt gets Saul's crew to try and find him, but it's a fruitless endeavor. It's not until halfway through the episode that we find out what happened, which is that Hank showed up last minute to stop him from burning the house down, and manages to convince him to join the fight against Heisenberg. When Walt gets home and finds out about the gasoline, he tries to get it cleaned out unsuccessfully, so he makes up another one of his extravagant stories about how he spilled gasoline all over himself. Not even Junior buys it though, thinking it was because Walt fainted or something. They all go to a hotel, and Walt tells Skylar the truth about what Jesse's up to, with this line of dialogue basically summing up their entire relationship.
He got upset over this something he thinks I did. I did do it.
Skylar's fed up with Walt's chicanery and suggests they kill Jesse, which Walt acts shocked by, as if he's above doing that sort of thing. Back at Hank's place, he makes Jesse tell the story of everything that happened from the start of the show onward, and then comes up with a plan to get Walt to confess his crimes by putting a wire on Jesse and sending him out to talk to him. Gomez is also there, and I'm a bit annoyed that we didn't get to see Hank telling him that Walt is Heisenberg, since it probably would have been a really good scene, but whatever. We also see how Hank has become consumed by his need to take down Walt, since he doesn't seem to care at all whether Jesse lives or dies. When they go to execute their plan, Jesse sees a suspicious looking guy who he assumes is a hired gun by Walt, so he gets out of there and tells Hank he has a better way to get him. It turns out the guy was just a random and Walt really did just want to talk, but now that he's out of options, he calls up Todd to organize a hit on Jesse. Number 42, Cornered. This is the one with the I am the one who knocks scene, which is a classic example of people taking a cringe Walt moment and turning it into some kind of badass thing. The scene's clearly meant to show how the pressure's getting to Walt, so he lashes out at Skylar and rambles about how cool he is, and he even immediately looks ashamed after what he's done, but people are stupid. This is followed by a great scene where Walt officially gets the car wash from Bogdan, with Mr. Eyebrows wanting to take his first dollar with him, but Walt using semantics to keep it, and then immediately using it on the vending machine. There's also this hilarious scene where Walt's pestering Jesse about his field trips with Mike, and he manages to correctly deduce Gus's plan to drive a wedge between him and Jesse, but he acts so cocksure about it that he just comes across as a massive
What, is there something about you that I don't know? Are you a former Navy SEAL? Do you have to have your hands registered as lethal weapons?
Register this.
All I'm saying, this whole thing, all of this, it's all about me.
When Jesse has to leave the lab to go hang out with Mike again, Walt gets mad about it and pays some of the laundry workers to come down and clean the lab for him while he mugs the camera, feeling pretty proud of himself until Tyrus arrives to ship them back off to wherever. Jesse and Mike are scoping out some meth heads, and Jesse uses his street skills to get into their house, and when one of them has a shotgun, he manages to knock him out with a bong, which Gus finds out about and is apparently impressed by. Meanwhile, Skylar's having a midlife crisis over whether she should stay with Walt or not, and tries to let a coin flip decide for her, but ends up just going back home anyway to find Walt got Jr. a shiny new Dodge Challenger, and because she's such a bitch wife, she makes Walt return it. Number 41. Over. This episode is filled with cringe Walt moments, since Skylar decides to throw a party for him to celebrate his remission. When everyone gets Walt to make a speech, he essentially says he low-key doesn't deserve to be in remission, and then when he's drinking with Hank, he gets jealous of Junior being so impressed with his Tortuga head story, so he tries to get him wasted to punish him, I guess. Then he throws a fit when Hank takes a bottle in front of everyone. Walt tries to make it up to everyone by spending the next few days installing a new water heater and fixing all the rotted wood in their house. Skylar and Junior don't seem to appreciate it though. While he's at the hardware store, he notices an up-and-comer meth cook trying to buy supplies, so he gives him some friendly advice. Then he decides to activate Epic Badass mode, and goes outside to intimidate the two guys while cool music plays. As far as epic Heisenberg moments go, I do think this one's pretty good. Meanwhile, Jessie and Jane get into a bit of strife when her dad shows up, and she doesn't seem too keen on formally introducing him. She makes it up to him though by drawing him some Rule 34 art. This episode also has another one of those teddy bear cold opens, which I of course hate. Number 40. Bug. This is where season 4 finally starts heating up, with Walt and Jesse reaching a literal breaking point while the cartel plot comes to an ultimatum. Walt's still stuck as Hank's chauffeur to and from various Fring-related establishments, with him coming closer and closer to unraveling the truth. Mike and Jesse are doing some routine work at the farm when one of their guys is suddenly sniped, but Gus is on top of it and struts out to show his massive balls. This scene is kinda stupid, but it does make sense since the cartel's just taking pot shots trying to drum up conflict. Ted's in deep shit with the IRS because he's an idiot who refuses to pay his bills, so Skylar comes to the rescue acting as a silly goofball to get them off his back, which works but only temporarily. Jesse visits Gus for a meal and has the perfect opportunity to poison him with the ricin, but he doesn't go through with it. He assumes Gus wants the all clear to dispose of Walt and proves his loyalty like a top G, but Gus actually wants him to come to Mexico with him to show the cartel how to make the blue stuff. Jesse gets freaked out and tries to get Walt to coach him for the big exam, but Walt's too stuck up about the ricin plan to pay him much attention. Eventually shit gets heated and they have a brawl for the ages, with Jesse managing to beat the 50-year-old guy with cancer. Number 39. Caballo sin nombre. This episode continues Walt's meltdown arc that was started this season, featuring classic scenes like him going Heisenberg mode on a random cop and getting pepper sprayed, the scene where Skylar threatens him with a restraining order.
I will get a restraining order.
Get your restraining order right here! Restrain this!
And of course the famous pizza scene, where Walt comes to Skylar with an irresistible offer of a pizza for the family, and even dipping sticks. This whole plotline of Walt just completely falling apart is one of my favourites in the whole show, and it peaks in another episode that we'll get to later. Meanwhile, Jesse enlists Saul in a scheme to get his house back, where he manages to buy it for $400,000 instead of $875 that they were asking for, by bringing up a meth lab that used to be in the basement. This scene is classic Saul shenanigans, and one of my favourites of his. It also leads to this great moment where Jesse shows up as his parents are leaving the house, and he gets to make a display of unlocking the door and dropping a zinger for the ages.
The new owners are expected at any moment. Where do you think you're going?
Inside. Bought the place.
But an even better Saul scene is in this same episode, where he visits Walt to give him a pep talk and make him feel better about Skylar ghosting him. And this is one of like 2 scenes across the whole show where Saul really feels like James McGill, especially this part afterwards where he gets in his car. I know it wasn't planned at all, but this whole scene just hits so hard after watching Better Call Saul and knowing that Kim's been out of Saul's life for like 4 years at this point.
And after a decent interval of time, well, there are other fish in the sea. You've been out of circulation for a while. I mean, you'll be just amazed at what's out there. Thailand, the Czech Republic. I mean, those women are so grateful to even be here.
Walt gets fed up and decides to break into his own house since Skylar changed the locks. While he's in the shower, the twins show up to pay him a visit, but are interrupted last minute by Gus sending his classic Poyos message thanks to Mike, who was watching the house. So yeah, really funny episode. Number 38. Cats in the Bag. The second episode of the show keeps up the quick pace of a pilot, with Jesse and Walt deciding to terminate their partnership after they dispose of Emilio and Crazy 8, only to discover that Domingo is actually still alive. They do a coin flip to decide who should have the pleasure of killing him, and Jesse wins. Walt wants him to dissolve Emilio in hydrofluoric acid, but Jesse can't be bothered trying to find a plastic bin big enough of a body, so he uses the bath instead, showing his resourceful thinking. Walt's too much of a pussy to deal with Crazy 8, so he just makes him a sandwich instead. Skylar hears Jesse's voicemail on the phone and does some detective work, finding his awesome website. She confronts Walt about it, and he says Jesse's his weed dealer, which Skylar seems pretty appalled by. Walt kinda loses his shit at her about it, but does so in a very nice manner.
What I need is for you to climb down out of my ass. Will you do that for me, honey? Will you please, just once, get off my ass? You know, I'd appreciate it. I really would.
Skylar pays Jesse a visit to intimidate him Heisenberg style, which works pretty well. Walt goes back to Jesse's place and finds out about his genius bathtub solution, just in time for Emilio's remains to come crashing down through the ceiling. This episode is also the one with the famous "not my house" line.
And we're gonna drive it over to your house.
My house?
Yes, your house. We're gonna drive it over there and park it overnight. And then tomorrow...
Man, not my house!
Number 37. Negro y Azul. Jesse's in a bad mood after witnessing the brutal ATM murder last episode, but after Walt meets up with Badger and Skinny Pete and sees how people are now afraid of Jesse because they think he's the one who did the crushing, he goes back to his place and motivates him by comparing him to a blowfish. This scene is just awesome, and it's always great to see Walt give Jesse a pep talk that doesn't have some sinister manipulation attached.
Who messes with the blowfish, Jesse?
Nobody.
You're damn right.
I'm a blowfish.
You are a blowfish. Say it again.
I'm a blowfish.
Say it like you mean it.
I'm a blowfish!
Blowfish! That's
Yeah! Blowfishing this up.
Hank isn't having a fun time at El Paso, with his colleagues being meanie heads to him behind his back. When Tortuga's head shows up on a turtle, they all laugh at Hank for being freaked out by it, but they get their comeuppance when the turtle blows up and annihilates all of them. This just makes Hank even more freaked out though. Jesse and Walt decide that they need more dealers and to start charging more once they corner the market, while Skylar goes to Ted's work to get a job. He basically immediately starts playing the moves, which isn't a good sign of things to come. Jesse shows off his new TV to Jane, which is enough for her to fall for him. This episode also has the weird-ass Heisenberg music video thing at the start, which is intriguing to say the least. Number 36. Crazy Handful of Nothing. This is officially the moment where Walt becomes an epic badass, when he shaves his head and starts blowing up buildings. Walt is unsatisfied with the rate Jesse's selling their product, and wants a distributor who can buy in bulk. Jesse gets Skinny Pete to introduce him to Tuco, who's impressed by his meth but isn't going to pay for it up front, and beats up Jesse when he tries to take the meth and leave. Meanwhile, Walt started his cancer treatment, and when his hair starts falling out, he decides to just get rid of all of it, which amuses Skylar and impresses Junior. Walt takes his so-called meth and hustles over to Tuco's hidey hole to get his money back, plus some extra for Jesse's pain and suffering. Everyone laughs at him for bringing more meth for them to steal, until Walt literally drops the ultimate one-liner.
This is not meth.
Yeah, this scene's kinda stupid, but this whole show is honestly kinda stupid, so it's not really a legit issue. Walt succeeds in getting his money plus a budding business relationship with Tuco, and goes psycho mode in his car to celebrate. Meanwhile, Hank does some digging and finds out that the gas mask he found was actually from Walt's school, and it turns out that there's some other chemistry stuff that was also taken. The DEA ends up arresting the random worker guy Hugo, who was a bro to Walt earlier in the episode, but Walt doesn't seem to care. Number 35. Buried. This episode is Walt's mad rush to hide evidence after Hank finds out about him, mainly his $80 million bed in the storage locker. Huel and Kubi arrive to clear it out, but not after doing a little lovemaking on top of it. Walt takes his 7 barrels of cash out to where him and Jesse first cooked together, and spends the night burying it. Skylar gets ambushed by Hank, who wants her to help him in the fight against Heisenberg, but she isn't interested. Saul proposes sending him on a trip to Belize, but Walt is disgusted at the notion, even though he just killed like 10 people in 2 minutes a few months back. When Walt arrives home from his excavation expedition, he has a little nap on the bathroom floor and offers to turn himself in for Skylar, but as long as she keeps the money. Skylar isn't an idiot and know that ain't possible, so she decides they should just lie low for a bit. Meanwhile, Lydia visits Declan's shitty meth lab to do some quality control, which involves Uncle Jack and his merry crew rocking up and executing everyone, while Todd makes the moves. Marie obviously wants Hank to go to the DEA with the news about Walt, but he's rightfully embarrassed that he didn't notice the truth literally staring him in the face for over a year. He decides he won't review anything until he actually takes Walt down, and when the opportunity appears to interrogate Jesse on the matter, who was busy being a nighttime philanthropist, he pays him a visit. Number 34. Peekaboo. This is one of Jesse's best episodes, with him on a mission to get back the money and meth Spooge and his chick stole from Skinny Pete. He psychs himself up with his gun and barges into their house, only to find that they're not there, but their 5-year-old son is. So he just kinda hangs out with his kid until the parents get home, and when they do, Jesse shows him who's boss, but the kid gets in the way. Apparently the money is inside this random automatic ATM machine that they stole, so Spooge gets to work trying to open it, while Jesse chastises the lady for being the worst mother in history. While he's trying to drill the thing open, Spooge has a yelling contest with her until she eventually crushes his head with the ATM, because she ain't no skank. Meanwhile, Walt's in hot water when Skylar calls Gretchen about her supposedly paying his medical bills, and she comes over to find out what the hell she's on about. Walt has a one-on-one meeting with her where he refuses to tell her what's going on and acts like a baby about how they apparently forced him out of grey matter and are profiting over his discoveries. The whole grey matter backstory is one of the most interesting aspects of Walt's character for me, with how he left because of his pettiness and still holds so much resentment for it years later, to the point where he goes on diatribes about it to both Jesse and SAUL. Anyways, Gretchen says she feels sorry for him, and Walt gives an appropriate response.
Fuck you.
Number 33. Blood money. The beginning of the back half of season 5 marks the start of shit rapidly falling apart. Hank has finally figured out the most obvious thing ever, and after having an episode while driving home, goes back through his evidence to do some detective work and confirm his suspicions. Jesse's in an altruistic mood and visits SAUL to give him his $5 million payout that Walt dropped off last episode. He wants half of it to go to Kaylee the time traveler and the other half to go to Drew Sharp's parents. Walt gets wind of this and tries to give the money back to Jesse, but he's wisen up to the fact that Walt definitely killed Mike, even though Walt gives a shitty attempt at trying to deny it. Maybe he shouldn't have made it so fucking obvious in the first place.
You get out safe?
He's gone.
Jesse gives up on Kaylee and Drew, and instead just drives around random neighborhoods throwing the money at people's houses. Later, while Walt is vomiting in the loo since his cancer is back, he realizes that the Leaves of Grass book he idiotically left on the commode is gone. And after checking his car and finding one of those tracker things that Hank had him use on Gus in season 4, he heads over to his house to confront him about it. At first they both try to play coy, but eventually Hank just cuts to the chase and sucker punches him. Walt tries to convince Hank to back down since his cancer is back and whatnot, and when it becomes clear that it's a fruitless endeavor, he switches to Heisenberg mode to drop a swaggy one-liner.
Maybe your best course would be to tread lightly.
It's unknown how long the two of them awkwardly stood in the garage before Hank opened the door again. Number 32. Problem Dog. Skylar makes Walt return the car he bought for Junior in the previous episode, but instead he decides to take it for a little joyride in a random parking lot, ending with him blowing it up. SAUL deals with the costs of his shenanigans while Walt complains more about his situation with Gus. Walt wants to hire a hitman to deal with Fring, but since everyone in that business knows Mike, he decides the second best option is Jesse. He heads over to his place for another round of obvious manipulation, and then makes him some ricin to poison Gus with. Jesse's immediately presented with several easy opportunities to kill Gus, but doesn't want to do it because he's too much of a nice guy. Skylar is ungrateful when Walt presents her with fat stacks of cash to launder. Meanwhile, Hank's deep into his investigation of the Chicken Man, getting Flynn to drive him over to Pollo's to get his fingerprints, and presenting the evidence to the other DEA guys. They don't seem convinced until Hank shows them Gus's prints were at Gail's apartment. Jesse goes to the support meeting and not so subtly goes on a spiel about how he killed Gail, aka the problem dog, and when he gets judged for it, he calls out the whole acceptance thing as being a load of crap, and reveals why he's actually there in the first place.
It's to sell you meth. You're nothing to me but customers.
This scene is just great, and probably some of Aaron Paul's best acting in the show. Number 31. Hermanos. This episode focuses heavily on Gus, finally giving us the big missing pieces of his character, mainly concerning his past. First, the DEA has him come over for a grilling on why his prints were at Gail's apartment, with Gus managing to spin up some story about how Gail wanted money. And when Hank says there's no records of Gus living in Chile, he just tells him to look harder. Hank isn't impressed and gets Walt to drive him to Pollo's for some detective work, and makes Walt stick a tracker thing on Gus's car. Hank is an idiot as usual and doesn't think anything of Walt's desperate attempts to get out of the situation. He rushes over to Jesse's place to tell him they need to accelerate their Gus murder plan, but Jesse isn't interested since he's in with the cool kids now. Gus has a meeting with Mike over whether Hank is an issue, and then drives over to Casa Tranquila to troll Hector for a bit. I know we take it for granted now, but the decision to have Hector, this random wheelchair guy from season 2, become an integral part of Gus's backstory is genius. And it's revealed in this scene why they got beef with each other, when Gus and his boyfriend Max tried to pitch their meth business to Don Eladio, and while Max is babbling on about how cool Gus is, he gets capped by Hector. This scene, and the rest of the episode, instantly shifts Gus's character from a cool bad guy to a way more complex character, and lays the seeds for his epic revenge just a few episodes later. The writers try to add more to Gus's backstory in Better Call Saul, but I think what we got in this show was the right amount for Gus. I think it's best the rest is left unexplained, since it doesn't really matter anyway. What I'm trying to say is we definitely do not need a Gus prequel show or movie or whatever. Number 30. Confessions. This is the episode where things officially go from bad to worse for everyone. Hank tries to get Jesse to help him with the Walt problem, but he still has too much of a hate boner for Hank to do anything. Marie tries to lure Junior over to the Schrader joint, but Walt guilts him into staying by revealing his cancer has returned. Walt and Skylar get sick of Hank being a nosy bitch, so they make a little video and give it to him during this very awkward meetup. Back at home, Hank and Marie watch Walt's confession and realize that Hank was actually the villain all along, but instead of turning himself in, he decides to double down. Walt and Jesse meet up in the desert for a little chat, while Saul awkwardly stands there, where Walt not so subtly tries to get him to leave town. Jesse finally hits back at him for being a manipulative but breaks down like a baby when Walt gives him a hug. Jesse prepares for his new life in Alaska, complete with a touching goodbye from Saul, until at the last second he realizes Walt poisoned Brock, and I have some problems with this. I'm sorry, but I just don't believe that Jesse in his current state would be able to make that leap from Huel pocketing his weed to the cigarette thing from ages ago. And the whole poisoning plot point is kind of vague in the first place, but I'll talk more about that later. It's not too bad though, since it does lead to this killer scene where Jesse goes psycho mode on Saul, with some insane line deliveries from Aaron Paul.
You had him stolen off of me, and all for that asshole Mr. White! He poisoned Brock, and you helped him!
Then he drives over to Walt's house to do some remodeling, with one of the funniest cliffhangers. Number 29. ABQ. The finale of Season 2 is a whole bunch of awesomeness and one big blemish, which I think is pretty obvious what it is. This is where the stupid cold opens from across Season 2 finally pay off, and it's not really worth it, honestly. I do like the idea of Walt being half responsible for the deaths of loads of people, kinda like a bigger, stupider version of Howard's death being caused by Jimmy and Kim, but it ends up just being played off almost as a joke in the end. But other than that, everything else here is really good. With Jesse waking up to the unpleasant sight of Jane's rotting corpse, leading to Mike coming into the show for the first time to clean up the place and give Jesse a pep talk. Meanwhile, Skylar and Walt Jr. are all excited about the cash coming in through the Save Walter White website, but Walt is less than enthused. Donald goes over to Jane's house to get a rehab journey started, only to find that it's already over. Walt takes Jesse to rehab, and then heads over to the hospital for some surgery, and while he's all drugged up, he lets it slip that he in fact does have a second cell phone, confirming Skylar's suspicions throughout the season. Afterwards, Skylar is eager to kick his ass out, and the scene where she finally exposes him is just so satisfying. I'm glad they got this reveal out of the way relatively early in the show, since Skylar's character becomes way more interesting once she has the knowledge of Walt's activities. During this whole scene, Walt's rocking this iconic pink jumper as well. He sits by the pool thinking about how much of a fuck-up he is, when suddenly the sequel to 9/11 happens above him. Number 28. Hazard Pay. This episode officially marks the start of one of my favourite plotlines, the trio of Walt, Jesse, and Mike going into business together, plus Saul for added chicanery. They all meet up at the Cathedral of Justice to set the terms, with Mike handling the business end while Walt and Jesse cook the goods. Walt doesn't seem entirely happy with the arrangement. They then go on a tour of potential lab locations, including Price's laser base, and eventually Walt pitches the idea of using Vamino's pest to cook inside people's houses. I really dig the scene where Badger and Skinny Pete go to buy the roadie cases for the equipment, where we see Petey's insane piano skills while Badger's just annoying in the background. Walt and Jesse get the mobile lab set up and get to work, segueing into my absolute favourite cooking montage in the whole show, set to this exquisite song by the Peddlers. The visuals during this sequence get pretty funky, and the music just goes so well with it. This whole episode kind of feels like the calm before the storm, where Walt is at his peak before everything starts falling apart. Him and Jesse are on good terms, he's making mad stacks, and everything's under control. Reality starts to set in a bit though when it comes time to receive their earnings. This scene is just so funny, with the money piles rapidly shrinking as the reality of running a business sets in. The dynamic between Walt and Mike is probably my favorite of any two characters, since they both just despise each other so plainly, and it's a big part of why I love the first half of season 5 so much. And when Jesse gets sick of their back and forth and just offers to take the money out of his share, that's enough for Walt to back off since he's far too cool to accept charity. Meanwhile, Skylar's down in the dumps with Walt moving back in, and when Marie acts annoying as usual, she decides to give her what she deserves.
I'm sorry. Please don't speak to me like that. I am simply saying that you
Will you
can't
shut
work
up?
out your-
Hey. Shut the hell up. Shut up. Shut up.
Skylar,
Shut up.
please
Shut up.
stop.
Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up.
Number 27. Green Light. This episode is the apex of Walt's meltdown arc, and it's honestly the funniest episode of the whole show. So many hilarious moments to be found here, starting with Walt trying to break into Ted's office to have a talk with him, which goes about as well as expected.
Open the door! Come on, let's talk. I just want to talk, that's all. Come on, let's be men about this, huh? Okay? How about that?
We have a situation in this. Walt. 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 What are you doing?
I'm talking with Ted. Next time, you'll open the door. There he is. Come on.
Followed by Saul staging an intervention for him, which is cut short when Walt realizes that Saul had Mike bug his house, which causes the two of them to have a little tussle, while Mike acts as their marriage counselor. Then Walt has Mike take the bugs out of his house, with some delicious hypocrisy to boot.
Great line of work, by the way. Real upstanding field. Yeah, well, I enjoy it.
And it gets even better still, with this scene where Carmen tries to have a talk with him in her office, and he tries to play the moves on her, which doesn't seem to end well. He's placed on indefinite leave, aka unemployment, and meets up with Jesse while taking his stuff to his car.
Yo, did he just get fired?
No. No. It's more like a sabbatical. Indefinite.
Walt isn't pleased to find out that Jesse's been cooking the product without him, and gets all high and mighty about how it's his formula and so on. He acts like Jesse's cook is crap compared to his, even though it's probably like exactly the same. There's also this scene where Mike updates Gus on Walt's downward spiral, and when he suggests letting him know that there's 2 Terminators on the hunt for him, Gus quotes Mike from 4 years prior.
If you want this guy to produce again, why not just tell him? You're the only thing that stands between him and an axe in the head.
I don't believe fear to be an effective motivator. I want investment.
You want to keep Varga for the long run? I don't think fear is a great motivator.
They decide to accept Jesse's meth in order to get Walt pissed off and back into cooking, which ends up working exactly as planned in the next episode. Meanwhile, Hank is in a foul mood because he has to go back to El Paso, but when he finds out that Blue Meth is back on the street, he immediately abandons it and rushes off to question some guy, and eventually finds this chick who Jesse gave meth to at the start of the episode. He uses his charm to find out that she got it from a guy who drives an RV. This episode is the chief example of a show being a really good comedy, and it's a big part of why Season 3 is one of my favourites. Number 26. 1 minute. This is basically Hank's episode in the spotlight, with him losing his shit and gamer raging at Jesse after he got trolled last episode, even though it was actually Walt who did it. So now Jesse's in the hospital, and Hank's in the shitter, with Jesse telling Walt he's gonna ruin that bald career, while Saul takes funny photos. Hank realizes he has a moral compass, and comes clean about his altercation, and the DEA is left with no choice but to suspend him and take his gun. Walt comes back to Jesse with an offer he couldn't possibly refuse, to cook in the super lab with him for half of his free meal. Jesse rightfully turns him down because Walt's an arsehole who ruined his entire life, but then when Walt says his meth is in fact not garbage, and actually as good as his own, that's enough for him to change his mind. This is probably the best scene of the episode. Aaron Paul is just so good at playing a crybaby. Now that he has Jesse on board, Walt calls up Gus to get rid of that pedo Gale and get Jesse on board, which he thankfully accepts. Hank is out buying shit for Marie, and when he gets in his car, he receives a call from Gus, using the Ghostface voice filter to warn him about the twins who are currently approaching him. Because they're the most incompetent hitmen alive, Hank manages to easily dispatch of one of them, and almost gets murked by the other, but he decides he'd rather get shot in the face than finish the job in a timely manner. That last scene makes this episode an instant classic, and the rest of it ain't half bad either. Still think the twins are lame though. Number 25. Mandala. This episode kicks Season 2 into ultra high gear, with the introduction of Gus, the murder of Combo, pregnancy shenanigans, and more. Jesse calls up Walt to give him the news that Combo was shot by some kid, but Walt is too much of a bonehead to even remember who he is. They go to Saul's office for some marriage counseling, and when he finds out how much meth they have on hand, he tells them he knows a guy who knows a guy who knows another guy who can put them in touch with a mysterious businessman with big plans. Walt and Jesse go to the top secret meeting place, but Jesse is high from his fun times with Jane and leaves in a hurry. When Walt complains to Saul that the guy didn't show up, he's told the deal's off, but goes back anyway and harasses Gus until he finally admits that he is in fact the guy. He criticizes Walt for working with a dumb idiot, but Walt says he's the alpha in the relationship, and manages to convince Gus to buy his 38 pounds of product. Jane introduces Jesse to heroin, which causes him to fly up into the sky and destroy the ceiling. Meanwhile, Skylar discovers Ted's tax fraud, but doesn't do anything about it because she's too horny for him. She continues working, and suddenly she feels her pregnancy being fast-tracked. At the same time, Walt gets a message from Gus that he has to deliver the meth in an hour for a cool $1 million, and rushes over to Jesse's acting like a crazed lunatic to get the goods. All this combines for a perfect storm, where Walt finds out about Skylar's fast-approaching baby while grabbing the meth, leaving him with a decision. Either be there for the birth of his daughter, or miss it and make fat stacks of cash. This is such a great moment, and of course he chooses to make the deal, because he's in the empire business, not the baby business. Number 24. Tohajali. Shit gets serious this episode, with Hank, Jesse, and Gomez executing their plan to get Walt while he runs around like a headless chook trying to find Jesse. Todd tries to impress Lydia with his not-so-blue meth, but she doesn't seem very moved. He gets a call from Walt wanting to set a meeting with Uncle Jack, since he's decided he needs Jesse killed, but killed nicely. Their only condition is they want Walt to cook for them, which he eventually agrees to. Hank and Gomez go to see Huel at a safe house, where they troll him with a photo of Jesse with his brains blown out so he'll tell them where Walt hid his money. Unfortunately, all the info he has is that they put it in a van, which doesn't have GPS. Walt visits Andrea to try and lure in Jesse, which doesn't work at all. Skylar and Junior are working at the car wash when Saul shows up, with Junior being utterly starstruck. Saul just wants to know where his boy Huel is, thinking that Jesse got rid of him. Walt receives a photo of his money, and then gets a call from Jesse who tells him he has to get over there pronto before he burns it all. Walt drunk drives at breakneck speeds out to the desert while confessing to like everything he's ever done because he's an idiot. He doesn't realize he's being trolled until he arrives, and when he sees the SUV rolling up, he assumes Jesse sent a squad to kill him, so he calls up Jack to get over there and save his ass, at least until he sees Hank get out of the car. He does a terrible job at trying to call off the Nazi assault, and finally admits defeat. Hank gets to slap the handcuffs on him and gives Marie a call to make it as obvious as possible what's going to happen to him. Right on cue, the Nazis roll up and start shooting the shit. The last 10 minutes of this episode are just so tense, and it sets up all the dominoes to get knocked over in the next episode. Number 23. Buyout. After their train heist had a little hiccup last episode, the crew has the pleasure of disposing of that kid and then deciding what to do with Todd. Jesse obviously wants to fire him, but Mike and Walt vote to keep him on, but not without a very stern warning. Mike decides that the DEA cock-watching him has become too annoying and decides to leave the business, while Jesse decides to do the same after hearing Walt talk about how distraught he is over what happened to the kid, even though he's whistling without a care in the world like some fucking cartoon character. Walt finds out they're planning to sell their shares of methylamine and launches into a diatribe about how it's worth $300 million, and Jesse selling out for pennies on the dollar, aka $5 million. Jesse later calls him out for this bullshit, since he knows Walt only needed barely $750,000, and Walt starts complaining about how he sold out his share of grey matter for $1,000, even though the company's now worth billions. Apparently $1,000 and $5 million are the same thing to Walt, so he doesn't listen to Jesse's attempts to reason with him, which gets interrupted by Skylar coming home. Walt forces Jesse to stay for dinner, and it leads to one of the most captivating scenes in the entire show. Walt sneaks to their base of operations to try and steal the methylamine, but Mike is one step ahead of him, and forces him to stay there with him all night so he doesn't do anything stupid. I wish we got to see more of what I'm sure was a riveting night of conversation between the two, but alas we don't. When Mike leaves to deal with some DEA malarkey, he ties Walt to the radiator so he doesn't escape. He escapes. Mike comes back from his meeting with Saul to find the methylamine gone, but Walt has another one of his genius plans so that everybody wins. I put this episode so high because I just really love the conflict between the trio, and any solo Mike and Walt scenes are always a riot. Number 22. Live Free or Die. The first episode of Season 5 jumps right into the wacky hijinks, with Walt, Jesse, and Mike teaming up to destroy the incriminating evidence left in the wake of Walt's murder spree. And as much as I would love to tell you about why this episode is so fucking cool, I think it'd be best if I hand things over to one of my colleagues. That's right, he's back.
Hello everyone, Johnny Cooper here. You might remember me as the dude who went on and on bashing on poor old Nippy, but not to worry, this will be the complete opposite. Live Free or Die is my favorite season opener in Breaking Bad. It is the start of the Heisenberg trio, we get a cold opening that leaves us with many questions, and Ted returns. After finishing Face Off, viewers wondered how Vince and the writers are going to manage to top off such an incredible arc that's been built up for seasons, that of the rivalry between Walter White and Gus Fring. The entire episode is a showcase of the consequence of everything from the end of Season 4. Just because the big bad is dead doesn't mean his entire empire goes away overnight. Live Free or Die establishes the rise and fall of Heisenberg's empire, which is my favorite arc of the entire show, starting with a flash forward that depicts the fall of Heisenberg, where we see an older, wrinklier Walter White with a full-on head of hair, messy beard, and no wedding ring, celebrating his 52nd birthday, who now goes under a different alias, Mr. Lambert, giving us a huge hint that this is like a one-year time skip since we've never seen him celebrate his 51st birthday yet. You can tell by this flash forward that Walter is on the run from the law as he's going by a different name and is no longer living in New Mexico. They've now given us a tantalizing glimpse of how the series will end, and this is the writer's way of hooking us back into the show and giving us a reason to tune in every weekend to see how Walter gets to this point. Walter buys a machine gun from the guns dealer whom we've seen Walter buy guns before in an attempt to kill Gus. We have no idea what he's going to do with it and who he's going to use it on. And at the time, neither did the writers. These motherfuckers were just making shit up as they went along. The build up to these flash forwards, which there are 2, ran over the course of 2 years. And it worked. The payoff was so epic and gave us one of the best finales in television, which is why it aged very well. Bravo, Vince. It's so interesting seeing Gus's former henchman, Mike, coming back to New Mexico after finding out his boss was murdered and knows exactly who did it but is stopped from killing him since they have to work together to destroy the evidence that has footage of him, Walter, and Jesse being in the meth lab in Gus's laptop, which is now in the hands of the DEA. So now they have to deal with the beginning of the Gus Fring aftermath as the 3 put their heads together and find a solution to destroy the laptop. This episode had some hilarious scenes that reminded me so much of the earlier Breaking Bad episodes.
Oh yeah? We're boned.
Well, you know how they say it's been a pleasure? It hasn't.
You gonna put on your black leotard and go dangling on a clothesline? It's a building full of cops. What else do you need to know?
And why in the hell am I talking to you?
I love seeing Walter, Jesse, and Mike interact and having to form an alliance due to the decisions that both Walter and Jesse made over the past 2 seasons. They have such an interesting dynamic that it made me so sad that it only lasted for like 7 episodes. Walter and Mike argue about how they shall do it, and Jesse comes up with the magnet idea, which is genius. It foreshadows Jesse being the one who plans the train heist, which is cool, and shows us how much more competent he is than these 2 old eggheads at times. Then we jump into the actual heist, where we see Mike Trouting all over the camera. Walter and Jesse drive the magnet-equipped truck alongside the wall outside the evidence room, as we see the magnet disabling the guard's computer, confusing him, and slowly seeing the items inside the evidence room drawn to the wall, damaging almost all of it, including the computer. Mike questions if the plan worked, and Walter smugly responds egotistically. However, it turns out the laptop with the security footage on was encrypted, and Gus is dead and therefore in no state to divulge the password, so there was no risk of the footage on it incriminating anyone, which means the evidence lockup attack was for nothing. Further, not only does it not solve any existing problem, it creates an entirely new one, as the police discover details of Fring's offshore accounts, unknowingly opening a new can of worms that will bring down the Heisenberg trio. Meanwhile, Skyler is informed by Saul that Ted had an accident caused by Huel and QB. In fear, he promises not to tell anyone about what transpired, and the situation with Ted is now resolved. Walter gets into a big fight with Saul over allowing Skyler to give more than $500,000 to the man she was sleeping with. Attempting to cut ties with Walter, Walter backs him up into a corner and threatens him. By the end of the episode, Walter drops one of the creepiest lines ever.
I forgive you.
It's the beginning of his descent into true villainy. Skyler is now fearful of Walt after he tells her it's over, She already knew that he was in the drug business and recently got quite a rude awakening that he may be involved in murder. But the fact that she is absolutely sure now that he is capable of doing such a deed has her permanently changed the way she views him in every way.
Number 21. Sunset. Continuing the trend of destroying evidence, this episode follows Walt trying to get rid of the RV before Hank gets to it. Jesse is completely oblivious to Hank's investigations, and is in fact working on starting up his own business with Badger and Skinny Pete. Walt begins working at the super lab and meets Gale, who immediately starts sucking up to him. Luckily for Walt, Hank calls him up to explain his theory about the RV being a mobile meth lab, giving Walt a head start to dispose of it. He goes to get it destroyed, but Jesse finds out and drives over to it, bringing Hank right along with him. So now they're stuck in the RV while Hank tries to bust in, and this is one of my favourite scenes in the whole series. The first time watching, I just had no idea how the hell they were going to get out of this situation. Joe is there to help out by questioning the legality of what Hank's doing, and Jesse tries to assert his rights too, but when it becomes clear he isn't going to budge, Walt takes drastic measures to get him out of there, by calling up SAUL to get him to troll Hank into thinking Marie is in the hospital. Hank drives off like an idiot, leaving Walt and Jesse to destroy the RV in one of the saddest death scenes of the series. Elsewhere, Gus gives the cousins the all clear to kill Hank, which I'm sure will work out great for them. We're now entering the top 20, and this is where the episodes start to get next level good. Pretty much everyone from here on out is a 10 out of 10, and the placements really just come down to minor differences and petty preference. So without further ado, number 20, and the bags in the river. This was the episode that got me hooked on this show. The main crux of the episode revolves around Walt trying to muster up the courage to kill Crazy 8, and the way it plays out is just incredible. First, Walt tries to come up with reasons not to kill him, which doesn't seem to convince himself. Then after he faints while bringing him food, he tries to get to know Domingo so that he can be convinced to let him go. They bond over baby cribs and whatnot, and the writing here is just so good. It finally seems like Walt's gonna let him go, until he looks at the broken pieces of a plate and realizes that there's one missing. It culminates in Walt having to strangle him to death with a bike lock, which is just so depressing, and pretty crazy considering this is only the third episode of the show. And even with this really dark scene, there's still wacky shenanigans to be had, like Walt chasing Jesse around and trying to flush his meth down the toilet.
Oh, Heil Hitler, bitch!
There's also Hank trying to show Walt Jr. that weed is bad for you since Skylar had a miscommunication with Marie, which led her to thinking Jr. was doing weed when Skylar was actually talking about Walt. We also get to see Gretchen and Walt from when they were in university, and it's all shot in shadow so you can't tell that Bryan Cranston is 52 years old. Almost as good a solution as the incredible young Jimmy wig from Better Call Saul. Number 19. End Times. This episode sets the stage for the final showdown against Gus, with Walt and his family officially being open season. The family is shipped off to Gus's house after the anonymous tip last episode, leaving Walt on his own to come up with a plan. Hank sends Gomez out to the laundry to try and find evidence, all while Jesse and Tyrus are in the lab underneath, but he comes up empty-handed because he's an idiot. Jesse gets a call from Andrea saying that Brock's in the hospital, and when he goes to have a ciggy and realizes the ricin one's gone, he deduces that it was stolen by Huel when he visited SAUL earlier. Of course he's right, but when he goes to confront Walt about it, he gets gaslit into thinking it was actually Gus, since we all know Walt would never stoop to such levels to get what he wants. This scene between the two of them is just so damn good. In fact, Bryan Cranston's acting here might be a bit too convincing since Walt is supposed to be lying out of his ass throughout the whole scene. Now is probably a good time to talk about my grievances with the Brock poisoning plot. Mainly how we just have no idea how Walt actually managed to poison him in the first place. Like, did he get SAUL to do it? Or did he sneak the berries from the Lily of the Valley into his lunchbox or some shit? And if so, how the hell did he do that? I get why they didn't show it, since we need to keep the audience in the dark for the plot twist at the end of Face Off, and it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but it's always annoyed me regardless. Anyways, now the dream team is back together, and they go to execute their plan by having Jesse lure Gus to the hospital, while Walt makes a bomb in his kitchen. Unfortunately, Jesse makes it too obvious that he wants Gus dead, and he wisens up to what's going on right when he's about to get in his car. Or maybe this bird flying by told him about it. Number 18. Box Cutter. What a hell of a way to start a season. Right after season 3's cliffhanger, Jesse gets captured and taken down to the lab where Walt and Mike are, and they all get to sit there and wait for Gus to come visit. Walt tries to talk himself up while they wait, and eventually Victor gets sick of him and decides to try his hand at cooking the blue stuff, since he's apparently watched him do it so much that he knows the entire recipe. When Gus eventually rolls up, he doesn't say a word and just struts over to get changed agonizingly slowly while Walt rambles on. And just when you think there's no way out for Walt and Jesse, he randomly slashes Victor's throat instead. Even Mike is shocked, but Jesse is out of fucks to give. Since it'd be a pain to dig up the lab to chuck Victor in that hole with Lalo and Howard, they instead dissolve him with the acid, which is honestly a way better method of disposal. I guess Gus and Mike just didn't know about it back then. Walt and Jesse go to Denny's with their new drip for a nice meal, with Walt thinking Gus is going to get them the first chance he gets, and Jesse just deciding to go with the flow. This entire plotline throughout the episode is just so tense, and I kinda wish it was the entire episode, since the non-lab scenes aren't anything to write home about. Skylar doesn't know where Walt mysteriously vanished to, so she goes to his condo to look for clues, except she can't get in. So she calls up a locksmith to gaslight into letting her in, only to find nothing. This scene is pretty funny though. Meanwhile, Hank's still being a to Marie, and needs her help to do a poopy. Unfortunately, he doesn't have Tony the toilet buddy to encourage him. Number 17. Dead Freight. Most of the episodes in this top 20 are full of drama, dialogue, intrigue, and other nonsense like that. And while those are all well and good, sometimes what you really want is badass action. Dead Freight is just awesome, with the gang putting aside their boring meth empire plot to go rob a train together. First off, there's this great scene where the motley crew forces Lydia to prove her innocence by calling up the DEA to report the tracker of a barrel of methylamine, while the boys listen in for a bug that Walt put in Hank's office earlier. Right when it's starting to look like Lydia betrayed them after all, they hear that some schmuck did put the tracker on the barrel, so it turns out she's in the clear. Mike still wants to waste her because he's a dick, so she offers them a way to get an ocean of methylamine from a train. Mike thinks there's no way to do the heist without killing the crew, but Walt seems pretty eager to go through with it, since the alternative is going back to a pseudo-cook. Jesse has another of his genius ideas to just rob the train without them knowing. The trio plus Todd put the plan into action, plus Bill Burr acting as the troller blocking the train. The whole heist is filmed and edited so well, and while there are some more impressive action sequences in Better Call Saul, I think this is my favourite across both shows. It's clever, it's tense, it's just cool. Especially when the Good Samaritan arrives to push Kubi's truck off the road, and the train starts moving with Todd and Jesse still on it. And just when you think they succeeded and it was all just a fun little adventure, the kid shows up to ruin it. Thankfully, Todd takes care of him. Number 16. Pilot. The first episode of a show is everything you could want. It wastes no time setting up our protagonists and all the side characters, the initial conflict is born, and then it's off to the races for a high-octane meth-cooking adventure. This is the longest episode of a series, and it packs so much into that 1 hour runtime, it's kinda crazy. We go from Walt sitting around eating veggie bacon at the start to him murdering people with explosive shit by the end of it. The very first scene immediately hooks you, with Walt driving around in his knickers and recording his message to Skylar and Flynn. Jesse's introduction is equally exciting, with him jumping out his window naked. When you think about it, everything that happens in this show is really Hank's fault, since he's the one who showed Walt how much money there is to be made in the meth business, and taking him on the ride along where he recognizes Jesse, and later blackmails him into cooking with him. Jesse introduces us to Crazy 8 and the one-episode wonder Emilio, who wouldn't make another appearance until 14 years later, in the second last episode of Better Call Saul. This is a good time to talk about the cinematography on this show, which is pretty great. Breaking Bad was shot on 35mm film, and it gives the show this delicious grainy look that fits perfectly for the vibe of it. And pretty much every shot has a slight handheld shakiness to it, which I'm less crazy about. I do think Better Call Saul has a much better presentation, but the clean digital footage with more locked off shots and smooth camera moves suits that show more than it would this one. Both do their jobs effectively, even if I do prefer Saul on the whole. We're also introduced to the first of many meth cooking montages, something that gets better and better as the show progresses. This is easily the best episode of season 1 for me, and thanks to it we eventually got to witness some of the best characters on TV, like Daniel Wormold and Tony the Toilet Buddy.
My favorite scenes are actually in my favorite episode, and that would be the pilot episode, episode 1. It just really set the journey for all these characters to evolve and to grow, and it definitely set the tone for the rest of the season, the rest of the series, and just the cinematics of what we shot and the big scale of using New Mexico landscape. To me, it all stems back to episode 1.
Number 15. Gliding Over All. The mid-season finale sees Walt trying to tie up loose ends after idiotically killing Mike. Now that he's the only vote left, he visits Lydia to get the name of Mike's guys, and then hires Uncle Jack to dispose of all of them in 2 minutes. This scene is just brutal, with most of the guys being stabbed repeatedly, and one of them getting the pleasure of being burned alive, all set to a nice upbeat song while Walt stares out the window like a cartoon supervillain. Hank finds out and isn't too happy about it, and reminisces about his old job with Walt. Lydia manages to extend her use-by date by proposing a business plan with Walt to ship his product to the Czech Republic, so him and Todd get to work cooking a shit ton of meth over the next 3 months, in one of the best montages of the show, set to the very appropriate song Crystal Blue Persuasion. Eventually Skylar gets bored of laundering the money and shows Walt the fruits of his labor, a giant pile big enough to have a nap on. Walt decides it's probably time to call it quits, and visits Jesse to give him his $5 million and reminisce about the good old days. So everything's back to normal, everything's happy-go-lucky until Hank goes to take a dump and finds the Walt Whitman book that Walt idiotically left there, ending on one of the biggest cliffhangers in the show. Thankfully these days we don't have to wait a year to see what happens next. It only took Hank 5 seasons to figure out who Heisenberg is, but at least he got there in the end. Number 14. Salute. This is where Gus's revenge plan he's been brewing for the past 2 decades finally comes together, with him heading to Mexico with Mike and Jesse to settle some cartel disputes. First, Jesse has to prove his worth by cooking up the blue stuff while everyone watches, and after getting berated for not knowing how to synthesize some acid, he takes control and calls the lab crew out for having such a disgusting setup, and tells them that no cooking is going to happen until all the contaminant has been cleared, much like Walt when there was contamination in the super lab. Jesse's cook turns out to be almost as good as Walt's, so they go to Don Eladio's to celebrate. Gus brings along a bottle of Zafiro Aneo that happens to be the same one Jimmy and Kim took a liking to, except his has the little side effect of making the entire cartel drop dead. Thankfully, Gus had the foresight to vomit in the toilet beforehand so he can strut out and take in the sight of Don Eladio falling in the pool. This whole sequence is just so satisfying to watch play out, and the shot of Gus walking outside and seeing the carnage with the music in the background is hard as fuck. Meanwhile, it's Flynn's birthday, and he's gifted an awesome car from Skylar, although he doesn't seem to entirely appreciate it because he's an ungrateful Walt isn't there for the festivities, so Junior drives over to his apartment where he finds him crying like a baby over how Jesse beat him up. Later on, Walt tries to get back on Flynn's good side by telling him about his father who had Huntington's disease, and Bryan Cranston's acting here is top tier. Junior doesn't really care though and leaves. Saul calls Ted over to his office to give him the good/bad news that his great-aunt Birgit has passed and left him the precise amount of money he needs to pay off the IRS. So he immediately takes the money and buys a new car because he's an idiot. Skylar tries to make him see reason and admits the money actually came from her, but Ted is still too stubborn to do the right thing. The Walt and Skylar scenes in this episode are really good, but the spotlight is all on the Gus plot, and it's nice to see that he got to complete his big revenge plan before he gets blowed up by Hector a few days later. Number 13. Grilled. In what was originally supposed to be the finale of Season 1, Grilled sees the short-lived Tuco plot come to an explosive end, with him kidnapping the meth-cooking duo and taking them out to his vacation home in the desert. Every scene with these characters in this episode is incredibly tense, with this being the first big moment where you're left wondering how the hell Walt and Jesse again get themselves out of this situation. They almost get lucky when Jesse tries to convince Tuco to try their latest meth/ricin invention, but he loses interest when Jesse mentions chili powder as the secret ingredient. They manage to sneak it into a scrumptious burrito instead, but Hector isn't quite as senile as he seems to be, and exposes him by ringing his bell non-stop until Tuco figures out what's up. Things eventually escalate to Tuco throwing them out of the house and putting a big gun to Jesse's head, but Walt interrupts him by dropping a pretty badass revelation.
We tried to poison you because you're an insane, degenerate piece of filth, and you deserve to die.
They manage to beat Tuco up and try to get out of there, but Hank shows up at the perfect time to have a heated showdown with him. This is really Tuco's episode in the spotlight, and it's a great send-off to one of the most memorable characters, which is impressive considering he was only in 4 episodes. The only reason this episode is here at number 13 and not like top 5 is because the non-Tuco-centric plotlines are just kind of whatever, with Marie and Skylar going around putting up missing posters while Hank tries to find Jesse, which is what ends up leading him to Tuco in the end. Number 12. Better Call Saul. This is officially where the show gets good, and it's thanks to none other than Slip and Jimmy himself. I know we take Saul Goodman for granted at this point, but I kind of forgot until my most recent watch just how funny he is. Like, literally every line he has is some sort of zinger, and they're all bangers.
What did the academy hire you right out of the womb? You guys get younger every... There are laws, detective. Have your kindergarten teacher read them to you, right? Go grab a juice box, have a nap, go on. Ah, here we go. Public masturbation. I don't get it. What's the kick? Why don't you do it at home like the rest of us with a big flat screen TV, 50 channels of pay-per-view, in a Starbucks? That's nice.
She better act in an epileptic whorehouse.
Is that like the one your mom works at? Is she still offering the 2-for-1 discount?
After watching Better Call Saul, the show, not the episode, it's almost jarring seeing him here, with how much more depth was added to him throughout that whole show. I guess this is a good moment to talk about how much I just love Saul's office as a location. The inflatable Lady Liberty, the blue carpet, the Constitution wallpaper, it all just comes together so well to create something memorable and iconic. Plus his car is cool as hell. This episode is also retroactively made better with Breaking Bad, the episode not the show, having additional scenes that take place during this episode. Mainly the RV scene, which was kind of pointless, and the Mike scene, which recontextualizes the entire thing, with Saul wanting to work with Walt despite Mike's rightful objections. But enough about that. The episode itself is just a whole lot of fun, with Badger getting arrested and Walt plus Jesse turning to Saul to get it all sorted out. The initial scene where Badger gets arrested is classic, with him taunting the guy for being the worst undercover cop ever until he gets pulled in by his chicanery. The scenes of Saul meeting Mr. Mayhew and later being kidnapped are both kino, with random throwaway lines turning into key characters years down the road.
No, it wasn't me, it was Ignacio, he's the one! Lalo didn't send you? No, Lalo? Who? Oh, thank God! Oh, Christ!
Saul's scheme to get Badger off is the usual wacky shenanigans we've come to expect from him, with them sending out a decoy guy to get caught on purpose and pass him off as Heisenberg. Kinda stupid, but the way it plays out is just so funny, with him sitting on the wrong bench so Walt has to send Jesse to get Badger to move, while Walt does some chicanery to distract Hank. Just beautiful. Such an awesome episode. Number 11. Crawl Space. This episode is mainly remembered for its last 15 minutes, but the rest of it is equally as good. The Mexico boys arrive at Dr. Barry so that Gus and Mike can be saved from their imminent demise, but the docs seem to care a whole lot more about Gus than Mike, since Gus is the one paying the bills. They fix up Gus pretty quick, but Mike still needs some R&R, so they leave without him. They just walk off by themselves, which I find weird that Gus wouldn't have some sort of transport waiting for him, but I guess he wanted to get some exercise in. Gus tries to broach the subject of cooking on his own, but Jesse is still loyal to Walt even after their little altercation at his house. They eventually get back to Albuquerque, and Gus immediately beelines for the nursing home so he can troll Hector about destroying the cartel. He tries to get Hector to look at him, all while Jesse just kinda awkwardly watches. Meanwhile, Ted is still being a prick about the IRS thing, with him trying to give Skylar back the money she so kindly offered to him to pay them off. Skylar decides she's done with Ted's malarkey and calls up Saul to take some more drastic measures. Saul sends his A-team out to Ted's place to intimidate him into writing a check to the IRS, but Ted sees an opportunity to escape and takes a page out of Chuck's book by slamming himself headfirst into the kitchen counter. Walt is still stuck driving Hank around, and when their next destination turns out to be the laundry, he takes a page out of Ted's book by slamming themselves into incoming traffic. Hank chalks this up to Walt just being goofy as usual and thinks nothing more of it, and Walt gets a cool bandage out of it, so it's all well and good. Eventually he finds out that Jesse is back and cooking without him, so he runs over to his place to yell at him again, and interrupts him playing Sonic 06 with Brock, who's somehow using a Dreamcast controller to play an Xbox 360 game. Anyways, Tyrus shows up to grab Walt and take him to the desert where Gus promptly fires him. Walt tries to continue his tough guy act, but Gus is out of fucks to give and lays it out for him.
I will kill your wife. I will kill your son. I will kill your infant daughter.
And then we arrive at the best scene of the episode, and one of the best across the whole show. Saul is about to call Skylar to break the news about Ted when Walt barges in, and damn, the acting here is just so good it's unbelievable.
Now, Saul! Yeah, you understand there's no coming back from this. I mean, you're gonna get new socials, new identities. You can't contact your friends or relatives ever again. How are you gonna sell this to that wife of yours and your teenage son?
I have got no choice. You need to call the DEA, and you need to tell them that Gus has a hit out on Hank. No, you have to do it for me.
Buddy, I gotta go on living here. No, I'm way too comfortable in my wingtip.
Just call anonymously.
You call anonymously!
I can't. I'm practically in the DEA family. I go to their Christmas parties, for Christ's sake. They know me. They know my voice. They'll know me. Please, you gotta do it for me. I'm begging you.
To warn anonymously? You did... Oh, God, you didn't do the sex robot voice, did you?
I did. The tube and the whole thing.
The whole call anonymously thing is a meme at this point, but it doesn't distract from how dire the situation and how well Bryan Cranston sells it.
You say whatever you have to say. You just give me an hour to... I need to collect my wife and kids. Okay? Just give me an hour, and then you make the phone call.
He runs home to grab the $500,000 he needs for his new vacuum cleaner, and things get bad when he realizes it's not there. The moment when Skylar says she gave it to Ted is just so funny when you look at it from Walt's POV, so it makes sense that he would break out into a laughing fit like that. Maybe the best ending to any episode, which is really saying something. Number 10. Ozymandias. Now I know what you're thinking. The greatest TV episode of all time, perfect 10 rating on IMDb, and here it is barely making the top 10 on my list. So yeah, this isn't my favorite episode, but I'm not saying it's bad or anything like that. I totally get why this is everyone's favorite, since it's probably the heaviest episode yet in terms of major plot developments. And seeing Walt's entire world fall apart around him is something we've been waiting for since the beginning. The opening takes us back to the first episode, back when everything was fine and dandy, and at the same location where the characters now find themselves. Hank's last moments aren't exactly what he was probably expecting, but it's nice that he held his ground instead of turning into a blubbering crybaby like Walt. I can't even really take the shot seriously anymore, and you can thank the internet for that. Walt idiotically lets the Nazis know that there's 80 mil buried in the ground.
$80.
So they take all of it except for one barrel because Uncle Jack's just such a nice guy. Walt decides that this is all actually Jesse's fault and takes his anger out on him by finally revealing that he let Jane die, which further solidifies Walt as the biggest alive. Meanwhile, Marie assumes everything is going great for Hank right now, so she struts into the car wash to give Skylar the good news, and also to make her finally tell Junior the truth. Eventually, they get back home at the same time as Walt, who tries to keep doing his usual everything's gonna be fine spiel, but Skylar assumes he murdered Hank, and he doesn't do a very good job at trying to deny it. Things escalate into an all-out brawl, and even Junior gets involved, before Walt finally realizes how much of a fuck-up he is. He runs off and kidnaps Holly as well, because reasons. Meanwhile, Jesse has become a literal slave living in a Nazi cage, which is kinda ridiculous, but whatever. Later on, Walt calls up Skylar to go on another Sigma male rant, but eventually it becomes obvious he's doing it to clear a name, because he's just such a nice guy. He gets mad at Holly because she wants her mummy back and dumps her in a fire truck, and then heads off to get a new vacuum cleaner. So that's Ozymandias, and like I said, it's clear why this is the number one for so many people. But for me, the last few episodes of this list just speak to me more. And at the end of the day, they're all 10 out of 10s anyway, so who really cares? Number 9. Face Off. The finale of Season 4 is just pure awesomeness. It's got it all. Suspense, intense showdowns, funny moments, and one of the best plot twists out there. Right after his little bomb experiment failed, Walt grabs it and takes it into the hospital, which Jesse doesn't seem to approve of. Walt needs Jesse to think of a new place to blow up Gus, but he's interrupted by the cops waltzing in to take Jesse away. Walt runs off to get Saul, but only finds Francesca instead. This is honestly my favorite scene of the episode, where Walt tries to do his Heisenberg thing with Francesca, but she's not having any of it, calling him out for being a dummy, and managing to convince Walt that he's gonna need 20 grand to fix the door he broke through. So now he has to go on a detour back to his house to get the money, and narrowly avoids being capped by Frank's goons along the way. Saul meets up with Jesse, who tells him about Gus's trolling of Hector, and Saul relays the info to Walt. He realizes the two are enemies and cooks up a new plan by having Hector go to the DEA to troll them and draw Gus's attention, leaving him with no choice but to execute Hector before he supposedly rats him out. The scene of Gus preparing himself to put an end to Hector is amazing, with Goodbye by Apparat playing over it, which just fits so well. Unfortunately for Gus, the guy who he'd been planning to kill for the past 20 years got the upper hand in the end, and he doesn't realize he's being trolled until it's too late. The death of Gus is so ridiculous in a good way, and it's one thing I think the show did better than Better Call Saul, in terms of the death of a main villain. My friend who I was watching with somehow hadn't had this scene spoiled, and his reaction was legendary. Walt sets off on his victory lap, meeting up with Jesse and burning the super lab down. Jesse finds out that Brock wasn't poisoned by ricin after all, and it was actually some plant called Lily of the Valley. Walt drives off triumphantly after telling Skylar he won, and then we see the background of a house and... wait a second. Number 8. Say My Name. Mike's story comes to an unceremonious end this episode, but we'll get to that in a minute. Walt uses his Heisenberg charm to convince Declan to be his new meth distributor, but conveniently leaves Jesse out when it comes to Mike and him retiring from the crew. Jesse later tries to get his 5 mil from Walt so he can dip, but instead is treated to another wave of manipulation. First with Walt trying to butter him up, but then when that doesn't work, he resorts to basically saying who gives a shit, we're gonna go to hell anyway, lol. Jesse just gives up and leaves while Walt yells at him like a spoiled child. He replaces Jesse with local child killer Todd, and tries to tell Skylar about it, but she ain't interested. Meanwhile, Mike is enjoying his new freedom by trolling the DEA by dumping all his criminal shit before they come to search his house. But the fun runs out when his lawyer gets caught during his routine hazard pay deposit. Thankfully, Walt happens to be in Hank's office when he hears about it, so he calls Mike to give him a head start on the cops. Mike decides he'd rather abandon Kaylee than be caught, so he runs off and calls Saul to get his emergency bag to him. Saul's too much of a pussy to do it, so Walt does instead, with him also trying to get the names of Mike's guys in prison from him. Mike tells him to get fucked and rips into him about how everything went to shit ever since he joined the drug business. It's satisfying as hell to see Walt get verbally demolished, but it's also true that Mike's basically a huge hypocrite in this scene. Mike makes the fatal mistake of hurting Walt's feelings and gets a bullet in the chest for it. Walt suddenly realizes he could just ask Lydia for the names and tries to apologize, which is just laughable, but thankfully Mike shuts him up before he can ruin the moment anymore. In the end, Mike got killed by a bald loser and left his family nothing. Probably a bit unsatisfying after seeing all the shit he did throughout this show and Better Call Saul, but I think it's what he deserved at the end of the day. Number 7. Half Measures. After finding out about Gus's connection to the dealer guys who got Combo killed, Jesse goes out on his own to get revenge. He plans to use Wendy to get some rice and lace burgers to the dealers, but when he tells Walt about his scheme, Walt is too afraid of getting in Gus's bad books to help him with it. Walt's worried about Jesse doing something rash and cooks up some half-baked scheme to get him arrested so he can calm down in jail. Maybe Walt's worst plan in the whole show. Mike shows up at his house to set him straight and reveals he actually works for Gus. Then he launches into the no half measures monologue, which is hands down his best scene in not just this show, but probably Better Call Saul as well. Jonathan Banks' delivery is just on point, and thankfully Walt doesn't have any annoying interjections. This scene instantly took Mike from a cool side character to a fan favorite.
How to make a pimento cheese sandwich. Buy yourself some pimento cheese and some white bread. You take 2 slices of bread and you spread the correct amount of cheese, like so. Then you close and you're done.
Jesse manages to get some ricin off the internet somehow, but when he and Wendy try to execute the plan, Mike and Victor show up to take Jesse to the chicken farm, where Gus gives him a stern talking to. Jesse doesn't back down until Gus tells the dealers no more children, so they shake on it and everything's all good. Unfortunately, it turns out they took the no children thing a bit too literally. I'm seeing a lot of people say that Gus did really mean for that kid to be executed, but I think it's more likely that it was just the dealer guys acting out because of Anyway, Jesse finds out and heads off to get revenge, even though it's a 2v1, but thankfully Walt comes to the rescue and murders both of them in cold blood, ending on one of the coolest moments in the show.
Run.
There's also this intriguing scene of Marie jerking off Hank. Number 6. Full Measure. Continuing right where we left off, Walt waits in the desert to explain himself to Gus, who isn't too pleased with his little hit and run. Walt uses his facts and logic to explain why it isn't worth killing him and Jesse, and they should just continue work as usual, and Gus relents because he's a good boss, on the condition that he gets to choose the next assistant. Walt returns to work and lo and behold, Gale is back, who later gets visited by Gus to tell him about Walt's cancer, and how he needs to master the Heisenberg recipe before he dies. Meanwhile, Mike goes on a stealth mission to dispose of some guys who are messing around with Gus's operation, and we're introduced to everyone's favorite character, Chow. This scene is like completely unrelated to the rest of the episode, but it's cool as hell, so I'll let it slide. After that, he goes to Saul to find out where Jesse is, but Saul's too good a lawyer to let it slip, at least until Mike threatens him. Their relationship sure has come a long way since the sticker days. Turns out the address Mike gets is bogus, and Jesse's really holed up at Price's laser tag joint, where he and Walt try to figure out what they're gonna do. Walt decides their only option is to dispose of Gale. When he goes to get the job done, he gets caught immediately, and dragged over to the laundry to be executed. This scene where Walt begs for his life and then flips the table on Mike is just so damn thrilling, and it's one of those few moments where Walt genuinely feels like a badass.
Just what the hell was that, exactly?
You might want to hold off.
Yeah? Why?
Because your boss is gonna need me. 6353 Juan Tabo, apartment 6. Yeah.
Even Mike is impressed. Unfortunately, it's now up to Jesse to kill Gale, leaving us on yet another painful cliffhanger. Thank God I watched the show after it was over, because there's no way I'll be able to wait a year after an ending like that. I could barely handle the 6 weeks after plan and execution. Number 5. Felina. Here it is, the series finale. Probably the go-to example when it comes to any discussion on the best TV endings. Up there with Game of Thrones and House of Cards for sure. And yeah, it is really as good as everyone says. I actually do have more issues with it than most other episodes this high on the list, but the impact is just so strong that it all just doesn't matter. From the literal cold open in the car, all the way to the last scene in the compound, every moment is pure satisfaction. I love just about every scene here, so I'll just go over my favourites. Walt visiting Gretchen and Elliot to troll them and give them his money so they can deliver it to his kids is hilarious, with him basically scarring them for life with his laser pointer chicanery. I like this flashback dream thing with Jesse making his box that he talked about back in Problem Dog, before the smash cut to him stuck in a Nazi compound. I appreciate how fucked up they made Jesse look in these last few episodes. It brings more realism to the ridiculous concept of him working as a slave for literal Nazis. Walt and Skylar's last conversation is hands down the best scene of the episode, with his confession that he did it all for himself honestly like making the entire show for me.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive.
He gives Skylar the coordinates to Hank and Gomez's bodies, which we know thanks to Better Call Saul that she managed to get a deal with. The confrontation at the Nazi compound is on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, with Walt saying screw it and just fucking shooting everyone with his machine gun contraption. He's nice enough to save Jesse from a crossfire, and he gets his revenge moment by strangling Todd, even though he brought him ice cream. Walt and Jesse's farewell look thing is cool, but if I was Jesse, I'd probably run that over on the way out. And finally, Walt's story ends where he was at his peak, in a meth lab. Yeah, you could argue things turned out too good for Walt, and that he didn't deserve to win in the end, but I think it was the right choice. And the Baby Blue song is pitch perfect, perfectly timed to that last credit. So which is better though, this or Saul Gone? It's Saul by a wide margin for me. There are aspects I think Felina does better, but on the whole I think Saul packs a much stronger emotional punch. The only scene in Felina that comes close to it for me is the I did it for me scene. Saul Gone didn't have any machine guns murdering people though, so I think we know which one is really better. Number 4. 4 Days Out. Before I started writing this video, I thought for sure that this was going to take the number 1 spot, because 4 Days Out is, for a lack of a better word, perfect. It's like a time capsule of that brief period in the show where Walt and Jesse were on good terms, just happily cooking their shit in the middle of a desert together. The vast majority of the episode is just the two of them playing off each other, and it's a joy to watch. The montage of their cooking session set to One by One by the Black Seeds is fantastic, with some really great time-lapse shots and some of the most iconic images of the series. Walt and Jesse's moment of celebration after they realize they've hit the jackpot is infectious. But the episode really gets going when they go to drive off to Denny's but the RV won't start. The double whammy of Jesse leaving the keys in the ignition and then later dumping all the water over the fire is painful to watch. And it leads to Walt giving up and rambling about death and all that until Jesse shakes him out of it and gives him a pep talk for the ages, saying they should build a dune buggy or a robot. Walt's boring and decides to build a battery instead, and with the help of Jesse's genius science skills, they're finally able to get the RV going again. Other great scenes include Saul laughing at Walt for having no money to launder, and the last scene where Walt has a gamer rage after finding out he's in fact not going to die in the next few weeks. Overall, an instant classic episode that really solidified the show as an all-time great one for me. Number 3. Phoenix. This has got to be my pick for the most underrated episode of this series, because I feel like I never see anyone talking about it online. This episode is amazing. The whole thing is about parents and their relationships with their children, and it all culminates in one of the most important scenes of the whole show. Walt misses the birth of his daughter thanks to his greed, but at least Ted was there for Skylar. Jesse freaks out when he finds out the meth is missing, and when he calls up Walt about it, he just hangs up on him because he's a dick. When Jesse confronts him about it face to face, Walt refuses to give him his share of the cash, since he'll apparently use it all to kill himself with drugs. When Jane finds out about this, she gets real interested, since her dad's being a real pain in her ass, almost calling the cops on her when he catches her and Jesse shooting the shit. This scene where Jesse defends himself with a baseball bat is so funny. Jane wants Jesse to get his money from Walt so they can move to New Zealand or whatever, and blackmails him into bringing it to them. There's this fantastic scene where Walt goes to a bar while he's supposed to be out buying diapers, and coincidentally meets up with Donald himself. They have this great talk about their families, and Walt mentions his so-called nephew, aka Jesse, with Donald giving him some good advice.
Family. Can't give up on them. Never.
This scene is just so fucking good. Walt goes back to Jesse to try and talk some sense into him, and we all know how this scene goes. In my opinion, this is hands down the worst thing Walt ever did. Letting an innocent person die solely for his own gain. The fact that he stopped for even a second to consider the notion of letting Jane die is utterly reprehensible, and it was originally going to be even worse. Yeah, apparently the original script had Walt injecting more heroin into Jane to purposefully have her overdose, which I'm glad they changed because that's just way too far. Even still, the scene is just so shocking, and it stands out as one of the defining moments of Walt's character arc. On a lighter note, Junior sets up the Save Walter White website, but Walt is an ungrateful bitch and complains to Saul about how he hates charity. SAUL apparently knows a Discord mod in Belarus who can launder Walt's money through the website, which Walt still doesn't seem very grateful for. But yeah, incredible episode, best of season 2, RIP Jane. Number 2. Fly. Did I really just put the filler bottle episode as the second best of Breaking Bad? Yes, I did. And it's because Fly somehow manages to tick all the boxes for what I want out of an episode of this show. Rian Johnson is our man of the hour here, and he really directs the hell out of this episode. There's so many cool angles and impressive camera moves that keep it interesting for the whole runtime, which is a feat considering basically the entire thing takes place in one location. It's just a shame that Rian never got the chance to direct a Better Call Saul episode, since he was too busy ruining everyone's childhoods. We all know how funny this episode is, but it also has some amazing character moments, like Jesse telling the story about a possum that was living under his aunt's house. This whole monologue is like 3 minutes long, and it's mostly just one shot slowly dollying in on Jesse. And then it's immediately followed up by an even better monologue from Walt, where he reflects on how much he's fucked up, and what the perfect moment for him to peace out would have been. I feel like I don't need to mention Bryan Cranston's acting, because we all know it's next level, but I seriously think this episode might be his best work. Things get really heavy when Walt brings up the night Jane died, and we met her father at the bar and all that. He goes on a Rick and Morty spiel about how the universe is random, and then comes insanely close to confessing what he did that night while Jesse's trying to kill the fly on a ladder. You can feel the genuine remorse from Walt in this scene, which is such a sharp contrast to his demeanor when he eventually does tell Jesse the truth. We also get to see how Jesse has grown, with him accepting that it's not his fault, or Jane's fault, or anyone's, except obviously we know that it actually is someone's fault. I think this episode's connection to Phoenix is a big part of why I love it so much. Like, you just heard me go on about how awesome that episode is. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the early scenes where Walt is trying to catch a fly, which are obviously hilarious. And when Jesse shows up, it gets even better, with him being dumbfounded by Walt's obsession with one little insect. But by the end of the episode, Jesse is even more dedicated to destroying it than Walt, with him getting to land the killing blow, filmed in glorious, ultra slow motion.
I love episodes of television like that, where just a few characters are forced to remain in a single location, because there's so much opportunity to reveal character stuff and relationship stuff and power dynamics and shifting intentions, and it's incredible. Because what it does is it reduces the size of spectacle, right? You don't need giant explosions or beautiful, gorgeous vistas of the New Mexican mountains. The scale gets shrunk down to this one room, so that even little moments become huge. When he falls from the catwalk or whatever onto the ground, in another episode that could just be like a small thing, but it was like this huge, horrible and hilarious moment. So I love episodes like that, and Fly itself specifically was exceptional. I mean, Rian Johnson is just an incredible director.
So yeah, can you skip this episode and not miss anything of note story-wise? Yes, but if you did, you'd be doing yourself a huge disservice. It's maybe the most memorable episode of the whole show, and it genuinely might be the best as well, except for one other. Number 1. Granite State. It took me an insane amount of deliberating on whether this or Fly would be my number 1. And while it would have been incredibly funny to put Fly at the top of my list, this episode is just too damn good to not give it the crown. Sandwiched between two of her most beloved episodes, I feel like this one gets overlooked by a lot of people. It's all about our characters trying to deal with how shit everything's become after it all blew up last episode, and it perfectly sets the stage with a finale. This is the last time we see SAUL in this show at least, with him showing up at the vacuum place to get shipped off to Omaha, but not before having to deal with Walt for a few more days. This final conversation between the two of them is my favourite SAUL scene in Breaking Bad, and if we include Better Call Saul, then it's definitely like top 5. He gives Walt one more bit of advice for old time's sake, about how Skyler's fucked if he leaves, and he should stay and face the music. The scene was already great when it came out, but it's retroactively made like 10 times better by the fact that Saul's advice to Walt is exactly what he ends up doing in the end of his show.
You walk in with your head held high, you'll be the John Dillinger of the Metropolitan Detention Center. How bad is that?
Bob Odenkirk's acting in this scene is so good, and the last moment where Walt tries to pull his usual intimidation tactic and fails spectacularly is the icing on the cake. One thing I do have to bring up is I always took the part where Saul says he'll be managing a Cinnabon as just like a random thing off the top of his head, but then in Better Call Saul, that's exactly what he ends up doing. Like, did he already know he was going to work at Cinnabon, or did he just decide to do it because it sounded like a good idea when he randomly thought of it? Doesn't really matter, it's just something I've always thought about. This is also the first and last episode where we see Ed the Disappearer, in this show at least. And for just one episode, Robert Forster really made his character a memorable one. All his scenes with Walt are excellent, especially the one where he visits Walt and gets paid 10 grand just to stay an extra hour. And he also has some of the funniest lines.
Mr. Megorium's Wonder Emporium. 2 copies. I'm not much of a movie guy.
One thing I wish we got to see more of was the public's reaction to the whole Heisenberg thing, and we do get to hear some snippets about it here, with some newspaper clippings in Walt's cabin, and a couple bits of info that Ed tells us. Skylar's having a pretty miserable time as expected, with a little visit from Todd to add to the fun, and Jesse's living in hell. He tries to escape but runs right past the cameras like an idiot, which leads to maybe the worst death in the show. I honestly think this took Jesse's suffering too far. Like he was already working as a slave for literal Nazis. Did they really need to throw a second dead girlfriend on top of a trauma pile? Walt eventually gets bored of his little goon cave and goes to a bar to call up Junior, who isn't too happy to hear his voice.
Why are you still alive? Why don't you just die already? Just die.
And so it looks like Walt's finally out of juice. He calls up the cops and waits for them to come to him, while he sits there drinking his dimple pinch. That is, until he sees something that triggers his precious ego, Gretchen and Elliot slandering him on the TV. The cops bust in moments later, but Walt's already long gone. This scene is without question my favourite in the whole show. Everything about it is just so perfectly executed, and it also has the most awesome use of a main theme song possible. The last shot where it dollies over to the whiskey glass perfectly timed to the last few notes of a song gives me chills every single time. Best ending to an episode without question, and Granite State is officially my pick for the best episode of Breaking Bad. Oh, thank God that's finally over. Now let's rank all the seasons. I know for most people season 5 is the best, but I really do love season 3, even though I do see a lot of you saying it stinks. Season 1's always been the worst for me, and season 2 is weighed down by its first half too much to put it any higher. But if we were to break season 5 into 2 halves like the way it was originally aired, the ranking would look a bit more like this. I just want to say sorry to everyone who waited so damn long for this video. I've been way more busy this year than I ever was last year, so yeah. The same guy who beat me to the SAUL ranking beat me again with this one, so karma I guess. But hopefully my version was worth the wait. As for how long it'll be until my next video, we'll just have to wait and see. So until then, thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe and all that shit.